right, now, moving on, the Franks. The Franks came to be ruled by a family called Merovingian. And again, folk, I have to pause here. Now, in modern times, I mean within your own lifetimes, a man named Dan Brown wrote a book, I believe it's called Holy Cross, Holy Grail. It was made into a movie. Any of you happen to know what I'm talking about?
Yep.
Okay, a few of you at least. And in which he claimed that the Merovingian, now the word Mero here comes from Mary Magdalene, that the Merovingian dynasty was descended from Mary Magdalene, and either, now folk, I don't believe it, either from Jesus or his brother. That the family, when the persecution in Jerusalem started, fled to southern France and worked their way up here to Paris and became the leaders of Paris. And the Merovingian dynasty actually believed that they were descended from David, Solomon. Of course, David was an ancestor of Jesus, and his brother James. From David, Solomon, and a whole line of kings. They believed they were very, very extremely special. And this proved to be their undoing later. Now, folk, this is a little bit of alternate history, but some people claim that World War I was the last serious attempt to restore the Merovingians. The Merovingians were eventually kicked off the throne, but during the deconstruction of some building, a paper was found that showed the Merovingian line that could put it up to modern times. The present King of Spain claims that he's a Merovingian. The Habsburg family that ruled Austria claimed they were Merovingians. Be that as it may, there are persons who say the Merovingians are the rightful heirs to the thrones of Europe. All right, we'll leave that for the moment and get back to serious history now, what's believed. The first Merovingian that we think about is Clovis. He's the only one I remember. Now, King Clovis was the grandson of the founder of the Merovingian, the great-grandson, founder of the Merovingian dynasty. And he is the first king of Europe who converted to the Roman Catholic Church. You might say, I thought Constantine was. All right, let me explain. Constantine converted to Christianity, but all the kings, all the Roman emperors who were Christian were Arian Christians. In other words, Arianism was the dominant type of Christianity, particularly in this part of the world, the dominant Christianity for centuries. And weirdly enough, today, you don't find an Arian. That word is spelled A-R-I-A-N.
That was the first type of Christian?
Yeah, well, actually now, I would not think so. I mean, Arianism was, when the Roman emperor, all right, let me explain. Arius lived around 200 AD, 200 years after Christ. And he got a doctrine today looked on as heresy. Every Christian today who knows this theology is against Arianism. The Greek Orthodox don't like him, the Romans don't like him, the Protestants don't like him. What did he believe? He believed that Jesus Christ was merely an exalted man, a high up man, but not God. The Roman Catholics, on the other hand, said that Jesus Christ was fully man and fully God, that Jesus Christ was divine. Arianism, like I say, had some logic to it, and I read a theologian not too long ago who said that if it weren't for the fact that he knows that Arianism is, if he had never heard that Arianism had been outdone or outmaneuvered, he might be an Arian himself because of the logic to it. Now, you might ask yourself, why is this important? Okay, folks, here's why I think it's extremely important. This part of the world that strongly embraced Arianism left open a possibility. If Jesus were only a man, there might come another prophet later. This part of the world then fell to Islam. This part of the world that said Jesus Christ was God, fully God, that means there's no room for another prophet. Therefore, this part of the world did not fall to Islam. Roman Catholicism was able to withstand Islam. Eastern Orthodox Christianity succumbed. This part, the Coptic Christians succumbed. Nestorian Christians, they succumbed. All other forms of Christianity, but the Roman Catholics. Now, part of this, you might say, oh, that was due to the fact that this part of Europe was farther removed from Arabia than this part of Europe, and all that's true, or the Muslims don't tend to fight as well in this type of terrain as they do in this type of open terrain from horseback on a wide open desert. All that may be true. Nevertheless, you can speculate, But back to this part of the story. Clovis was the first Roman Catholic king in Western Europe, and after him, virtually all kings who claimed to be Christian after him were Roman Catholic. Clovis went on to conquer much of France, and then, folks, the Merovingian dynasty, the story takes a rather ugly twist. The Merovingian family believed that they were a special group and had special blood in their veins, and therefore they should never mix with any other type of inferior blood. Therefore, the Merovingian kings married their cousins, because they were, after all, close related to the Merovingians. What this did, it guaranteed that the Merovingian dynasty became a dynasty of weak and sickly kings who only lived about 20 years. So a typical Merovingian, he'd be born to a father who maybe be 15 years old or 16. After about 6 years, his father would die at the age of about 21. So this boy would be crowned king at the age of 6, and he'd be weak and sickly himself. When he turned 15, they'd marry him off fast, realizing, looks, we've got to keep the dynasty alive. They'd marry him off fast. About 16, he'd have a son, hopefully that soon. Then he would himself would die in the early 20s, being weak and sickly. And this went on for about 200 years. After a time, the people of France got tired of having weak, sickly kings who were good for nothing, and all the work was being done by the mayors of the palace anyway. Now, the first mayor of the palace to really assert himself was Charles Martel. You may recall I talked about him before. He was the one who defeated the Franks, who defeated the Muslims in the Battle of Tours. Charles Martel met the Muslims down in here, defeated them, and stopped the Muslim advance into France. He had a son named Pepin, sometimes called Pepin the Short. Pepin wrote a letter to the Pope, and in effect said, "Your Holiness, I feel like I should be king because the mayors, the real kings are worth nothing. They're utterly worth, because they're sick all the time." The Pope gave his blessing, so the people, the nobility of France raised Pepin up on one of their shields, held him high, he was a little man, and proclaimed him king. And the last Merovingian then was put in a monastery, hopefully to die out, even though supposedly the family lives on somewhere. But anyway, the last Merovingian we know of supposedly was killed in battle in the year 1500, but again, folk, depends on who you read and when you read it. But Pepin then took over, and he became the first king of a new dynasty called the Carolingian dynasty, named after Charles Martel. When Pepin died, the throne went to the man we were talking about earlier, Charlemagne, known as Charles the Hammer, or Charles the Great. Now, I had three of them in line: Charles Martel, Pepin, and Charlemagne. The three of them ruled for a period of 99 years. Anyway, yes?
All right, so Charles Martel was the mayor of the palace?
He was mayor of the palace only. He was mayor of the palace. Then came Pepin. He started out as mayor of the palace, but then he had himself crowned king.
So Charles Martel was never king? He
was never king. He was merely mayor of the palace. But he was the one who led the army, who defeated the Moors, or the Saracens, the Muslims from Spain. Then King Pepin, he was the one who had himself crowned king. Then Charlemagne, he is the one we talked about at the beginning of the chapter. He had the biggest empire Europe was to have for hundreds of years. Now, we want to talk a little bit more about Charlemagne. Anyway, but we'll get back to Charlemagne in a little bit. Before we do, though, we have to talk about the society of these people here. The German people, unlike the Chinese, they organize themselves into extended families. In other words, your grandparents and your parents and your cousins, first cousins. Whereas the Chinese, they descended from your great-great-grandparents. And again, not many of us see or ever meet our great-great-grandparents. But in the case of the Europeans, the Germanic people at least, it was the extended family. In other words, brothers, sisters, and cousins, and grandparents. Women were expected to obey their father while they were at home, and then when she married, she was expected to obey her husband. About 1 woman in 7 died in childbirth. Consisted for most women of domestic labor, providing food and clothing, caring for the children, assisting with various farming chores. Now, German law started out being somewhat personal. Basically, it was revenge. In other words, if you hurt a member of my family, all of my family is going to come after you. Well, what this did, this led to endless family quarrels. One of the more famous being the family quarrel between the Montagues and Capulets in India, I mean in Italy, that is part of the story of Romeo and Juliet. Any of you have studied Romeo and Juliet in high school? Yeah. This, on a more personal note, I've done some research on the Cunningham name, and in Scotland, the Cunninghams got in a feud with the Montgomerys. And one time, Montgomery ambushed and killed 13 Cunninghams, and the Cunninghams rallied and they killed a bunch of Montgomerys. The King of Scotland tried to intervene, but the two sides kept fighting each other. And this feud ran down the generations also. Now, in American history, the most famous feud was a feud between the Hatfields and McCoys that lasted about 100 years, down about 3 or 4 generations. The governors of 2 states vowed they would stop the fighting but couldn't. Today, the Hatfields and McCoys live in peace. Their descendants, meet every year, have a big picnic together and reminisce about old times. But at one time, they killed each other, sometimes 4 or 5 at a time. But this is where revenge led. Finally, the Germans got the idea that, hey, a crime is really a matter for the state to decide. So if somebody commits a crime against you, report it to the state, press charges, and see what the state does about it. But it's a matter not for personal vengeance, but a matter for the state. Eventually they made use of a fine called a wehrgeld. Now, wehrgeld. That's where that in the place of having your eyes gouged out or being severely whipped, you'd pay a certain sum of money determined by the judges to satisfy the requirements of the offended family, a wehrgeld. There was another, and this is not mentioned in the book, but I want to tell you, it's on one of the tests. I don't know if you'll get it or not, but it's called a compurgation, C-O-M-P-U-R. That's where a bunch of people get together and swear oaths. In other words, I swear that this person's innocent. Well, I was with this person at the time and I swear he didn't do it. You get a bunch of people to swear an oath. It's called compurgation. Again, this is not in a book, but I made out the test a couple weeks ago and hope it's on one of the tests. For those of you who are here, you heard that. Swearing of oaths of innocence. Fine, wehrgeld. Now the third one I want to elaborate on, called ordeal. Your book elaborates on it. It devotes more than a half a page to the subject of ordeal on page 330. Essentially, ordeal is where the accused person might walk on a bed of hot coals or walk on hot irons, red hot iron, and afterwards they would examine his feet to see how badly he blistered. If he healed quickly, he was deemed innocent. If he took forever to heal, a long time to heal, he was considered guilty. Now, folks, before you think this is a bunch of nonsense, it is known that guilt can make a person sick, weak, Guilt is believed to be a cause of cancer. Guilt can make a person heal more slowly than an innocent person would. But anyway, they undergo some kind of pain, and it was believed that God would help the person who was innocent, prove he was innocent by letting this person heal up quickly. Now, I want to elaborate on a little bit. In modern times, we have something that reminds me somewhat of the ordeal called a lie detector. It is known that for some people, their blood pressure will change when they're asked a question about which they don't want to talk about. Or if they are lying, their blood pressure will change, their pulse rate will go up. Now, there is a problem with it, and it's now not hardly admissible in court. Because a person who lies habitually, all the time, constantly, can fool a lie detector. They can lie without their blood pressure, they can lie without blushing, lie without their blood pressure changing. And of course, it's also been said if you go 30 or so hours or 40 hours without sleep before the test, that's a guarantee that you'll pass the test also, because you're too tired to care. Anyway, this, I don't know how many of you heard this, but I will say this: a person I worked with at Lockheed went to prison based in part on the results of a lie detector test. He said he didn't do what he was accused of, but the lie detector test showed he lied several times during the test, and this helped convict him.
That like makes you nervous, like taking a lie detector.
What's that?
Like if you just get nervous.
You get nervous
Something like
taking it,
that.
but the next person supposed can tell me. They'll start out asking you a question of what is your name, where do you live? And, oh yeah, I can answer this. What's your social security number? Yeah, I know that. Did you steal the jewelry? At that point, you get all jittery. No. The needle rises greatly, you know. Anyway. But